Remember that one moment in Vale when we were standing beneath the chairlift?
With the Hunsuckers, I think.
Yeah, the Hunsuckers. Yeah, we were.
When Hart to Hart first hit television screens in 1979, audiences were instantly charmed by the glamorous adventures of Jonathan and Jennifer Hart, a wealthy couple who moonlighted as amateur detectives. The series promised romance, luxury, and danger, all wrapped in the dazzling package of 1980s television excess. But beneath the polished surface of champagne flutes, fast cars, and crime-solving capers, there were truths hidden in plain sight, details most fans never noticed. And as the years went on, the cast themselves would quietly admit that the picture-perfect image of the show wasn't always what it seemed. The question is, what really went on behind the cameras of Hart to Hart that fans never realized? Stay with us as we find out. From the outside, Hart to Hart looked like a dream production. A Hollywood power couple jetting around the world, stylish costumes that oozed sophistication, and a storyline that gave viewers the thrill of mystery without ever leaving the comfort of primetime television. Robert Wagner, suave and polished, embodied Jonathan Hart, while Stephanie Powers dazzled as the clever, quick-witted Jennifer. Together, they were television's golden duo. But behind the cameras, the dynamic wasn't always as smooth as it appeared. What fans rarely realized was that both stars came into the series with heavy baggage. Robert Wagner had been through years of personal turmoil, including the tragic death of his wife Natalie Wood, which still haunted him when the show began filming. Stephanie Powers, meanwhile, was managing her own private struggles, balancing an intense work schedule while caring for her long-term partner, actor William Holden, whose alcoholism was beginning to spiral. The emotional weight both actors carried inevitably bled into the set, though most fans never picked up on it. Crew members later revealed that tension often simmered during production, not because of outright hostility, but because the stakes were incredibly high. Wagner and Powers weren't just playing roles, they were carrying their reputations, their grief, and their ambitions into every scene. Producers demanded perfection, pushing the actors to deliver chemistry that felt effortless, even on the days when the weight of their personal lives was almost unbearable. There were also whispers of creative clashes. Wagner, already an established Hollywood figure, reportedly wanted more control over the direction of the show. Stephanie, fiercely independent, wasn't about to take a back seat. Their disagreements were rarely explosive, but subtle battles of ego unfolded in rehearsals and script meetings. Powers once admitted in an interview that she fought hard to keep Jennifer Hart from becoming a mere accessory to Jonathan, a move that put her at odds with certain producers who envisioned the female lead as ornamental rather than equal. The very fact that she succeeded in shaping Jennifer into a strong, witty counterpart is proof of the battles happening behind the scenes. But the tensions weren't limited to the stars. The crew, too, often found themselves at odds with the image of opulence the show projected. Shooting on location with expensive cars, elaborate costumes, and elaborate sets was glamorous for the audience, but exhausting and expensive for the production team. Rumors circulated that schedules frequently ran over, budgets stretched thin, and tempers flared when expectations clashed with reality. For a series built on portraying wealth and perfection, it took a staggering amount of effort to maintain the illusion. What's most fascinating is how seamlessly the cast managed to hide these fractures from the audience. On screen, Jonathan and Jennifer Hart radiated charm, love, and partnership. Off-screen, Wagner and Powers were sometimes barely speaking after long days of heated creative debates. Yet when the cameras rolled, they slipped back into their roles, fooling millions of viewers who never guessed the strain behind those sparkling smiles. Some insiders even suggest that the unspoken tension between the stars added to their chemistry. Their relationship wasn't just scripted, It carried the real-life friction of two strong personalities colliding and cooperating in equal measure. That underlying push and pull gave their performances an authenticity that no amount of directing could manufacture. It's no wonder fans described their connection as electric. It was rooted in something rawer than pure acting. And then there was the darker truth: Hollywood's obsession with image. Both Wagner and Powers were expected to embody the glamour and perfection of their characters, even when real life was far messier. Wagner's grief over Natalie Wood was something the studio never wanted acknowledged, while Powers' battle to protect her identity as an actress, not just a sidekick, was carefully hidden from the public. The world saw diamonds and champagne, but the cast lived through pressure and pain. By the time the show reached its later seasons, those hidden tensions had become part of the production's DNA. The actors had grown used to masking exhaustion, disagreements, and grief with polished performances. For the viewers, it was seamless entertainment. But for the cast and crew, every episode carried the weight of secrets few would ever know. One of the defining images of Hart to Hart was the Hart Mansion, an opulent estate with sprawling grounds, marble interiors, and the kind of luxury that embodied every viewer's fantasy of wealth in the 1980s. The mansion wasn't just a backdrop, it was a character in itself, a symbol of Jonathan and Jennifer's high society lifestyle. To fans, it seemed perfectly real, perfectly attainable, if only you had their kind of fortune. But behind the camera, the truth about the mansion and its glamorous trappings was far from what viewers believed. First, the mansion itself was not owned by the Harts or even rented full-time for the show. Instead, the exterior belonged to an actual Beverly Hills estate that producers carefully negotiated to use for filming. While it looked seamless on screen, the Hart Mansion wasn't a single, unified property. Interiors were filmed on sound stages, dressed up with lavish set designs, while exteriors came from multiple real locations. Fans never noticed that the front gates in one episode didn't quite match the driveway in another, or that the living room windows didn't line up with the outdoor architecture. Hollywood magic stitched together what seemed like a cohesive home, but in reality, it was a patchwork illusion. This illusion extended to the so-called luxuries inside. The Hart's lavish decor, crystal chandeliers, priceless artwork, and designer furniture was often rented for specific shoots. Producers didn't actually buy those items. Some of the most dazzling objects in the Hart living room were borrowed props returned after filming. Even Jennifer's famous closet, bursting with expensive gowns, wasn't her own wardrobe. Many of the outfits were studio costumes recycled from previous productions, carefully refitted to look like cutting-edge fashion. Audiences saw wealth. The reality was careful budgeting disguised as elegance. But perhaps the most surprising secret was the cars. Jonathan Hart's fleet of expensive vehicles, sleek convertibles, luxury sedans, even the occasional exotic sports car, was a huge part of the show's glamour. Yet, just like the mansion, the truth was more complicated. Most of the cars weren't permanently owned by the production. They were leased short-term, borrowed from collectors, or even shared between other TV shows filming around Los Angeles at the time. On occasion, sharp-eyed viewers have since spotted the same car reappearing in other shows of the era, just repainted or slightly altered. For fans who believed the Harts lived in uninterrupted opulence, these details remained invisible. Behind the scenes, the production team was constantly battling to maintain the illusion of wealth without sinking the budget. One crew member later admitted that entire days of filming were lost because a rented car wasn't delivered on time, or a prop house failed to provide the right chandelier. The Hart Mansion was meant to feel effortless, but the effort behind it was staggering. And then there were the continuity errors that almost exposed the illusion. In one famous blooper, The Hart's bedroom window showed a city skyline in one shot and a garden in another, two completely different backdrops that revealed how inconsistent the sets really were. Most fans overlooked these details, too caught up in the glamour and drama to question what they saw. But cast members knew. Stephanie Powers once joked that she had to remind herself which house she was walking into on any given day, because the sets rarely matched the exteriors. Still, the deception went deeper than props and sets. The Hart lifestyle wasn't just fabricated on screen, it was carefully curated off-screen too. Publicity photos of Robert Wagner and Stephanie Powers often featured them posed in their mansion, with gleaming cars parked outside as if they actually lived there. The network wanted viewers to blur the lines between fiction and reality, convincing audiences that the fantasy of the Harts extended beyond the episodes. Wagner and Powers were pressured to embody this luxurious image in interviews and appearances, even when their real lives looked very different. For Robert Wagner, whose personal history was marked by tragedy and scandal, the role of Jonathan Hart became a kind of mask, a way to project stability and glamour when the truth was anything but. For Stephanie Powers, who was privately exhausted by her caregiving duties to William Holden, the image of Jennifer Hart as a carefree socialite felt almost cruelly ironic. They were asked to live in the mansion publicly, even if privately they returned to lives far less perfect. What fans never realized was that the Hart Mansion was not simply a glamorous set. It was a metaphor for the entire show. Beautiful on the outside, built on illusions, and carefully maintained to prevent cracks from showing. The gleaming gates, the sparkling chandeliers, and the perfectly polished cars were all pieces of a facade, assembled with precision to give audiences their dream world. And yet, perhaps that illusion is exactly what made Hart to Hart so successful. Fans didn't want reality, they wanted escape. The mansion gave them that escape, even if it was stitched together from mismatched sets, rented props, and cars borrowed for a few hours of screen time. The cast and crew knew the truth, but viewers never noticed. On screen, Robert Wagner and Stephanie Powers embodied the perfect couple. Jonathan and Jennifer Hart were equals in every sense, partners in love, wit, and crime-solving. Their banter was sharp, their chemistry magnetic, and their teamwork effortless. But off-screen, the reality wasn't quite so simple. Beneath the polished veneer of mutual respect lay a subtle rivalry that simmered quietly throughout the show's run, a rivalry that most fans never even suspected. Robert Wagner entered Hart to Hart as a seasoned Hollywood figure. By the late 1970s, he had decades of film and television experience, a reputation as a leading man, and the aura of old-school stardom. Stephanie Powers, on the other hand, while successful, was still carving out her place in the industry. She had starred in several television series and films, but had yet to secure the kind of iconic role that would define her career. Hart to Hart promised that opportunity. But with Wagner already established as a household name, it was clear from the start who the producers initially intended as the central star. This imbalance didn't sit well with Powers. Determined not to be overshadowed, she pushed for Jennifer Hart to be written as more than just Jonathan's glamorous companion. She wanted Jennifer to be sharp, witty, and just as central to solving the mysteries as Jonathan. Powers fought battles over scripts, challenging producers who tried to write her into secondary roles or who treated her character as a decorative accessory. Wagner, meanwhile, wasn't blind to her determination. Though he admired Powers' talent, he also valued his own star power and was not always comfortable with her encroaching on the spotlight. Insiders recall moments when Wagner would quietly lobby for storylines that emphasized Jonathan's leadership, while Powers simultaneously argued for scripts that gave Jennifer equal weight. These tug-of-wars rarely erupted into open hostility, but they created a persistent undercurrent of competition. What makes the rivalry so fascinating is that it translated into an undeniable on-screen chemistry. The push and pull between Wagner and Powers mirrored the dynamic between Jonathan and Jennifer. Their banter sparkled not just because of good writing, but because it carried the energy of two strong personalities negotiating space. Viewers saw a couple who adored one another, but who also challenged each other constantly. And that tension was rooted in the very real struggle for equality behind the scenes. There were other, subtler signs of rivalry. Powers became known for her impeccable style on the show, wearing high-fashion outfits that often outshone Wagner's more traditional wardrobe. Costume designers sometimes found themselves in the middle of disputes when both stars had strong opinions about how their characters should appear. Wagner wanted Jonathan to project old-world sophistication, while Powers pushed for Jennifer to embody modern glamour and independence. Even their wardrobes became a symbolic battlefield in the ongoing competition for the spotlight. The media, of course, played its role in amplifying the rivalry. Interviews with Wagner often highlighted his role as the show's anchor, the suave leading man. Powers, meanwhile, was frequently asked questions about fashion or her status as Wagner's on-screen partner, a framing that frustrated her. She wanted recognition for her craft, not just her beauty. The more she fought for respect, the more she bristled at being cast as the supporting half of the duo. Still, despite these tensions, both actors were consummate professionals. They never allowed their rivalry to derail production or tarnish the image of the Harts. Instead, they channeled their competitive energy into performances that elevated the show. Powers made Jennifer Hart unforgettable, not because she was written that way, but because she insisted on it. Wagner, unwilling to be outdone, ensured Jonathan remained charismatic, clever, and commanding. Together, they created a balance that kept audiences hooked. In later years, both Wagner and Powers downplayed any suggestion of rivalry, insisting their relationship was one of mutual respect. And, to a degree, that was true. They admired one another's talent, shared laughs between takes, and built a genuine friendship that outlasted the series. But the truth remains that their partnership was never purely harmonious. It was sharpened by the edge of competition, an edge that fans never noticed, but that infused their performances with vitality. The irony is that the very thing fans loved most about Hart to Hart, the palpable spark between Jonathan and Jennifer, was born out of this subtle struggle. The show thrived because neither actor was willing to be overshadowed, and that determination drove them both to deliver their best work. When fans think of Hart to Hart, they remember Robert Wagner and Stephanie Powers, the glamorous couple who seemed to glide effortlessly through danger and intrigue. But loyal viewers will also recall the show's beloved supporting cast, particularly Lionel Stander as Max, the gruff but lovable chauffeur and confidant, and Freeway, the Hart's adorable dog who melted hearts with every bark. Yet what most fans never realized was that the supporting cast carried their own mysteries, sudden absences, unexplained changes, and behind-the-scenes drama that often went unnoticed. Take Lionel Stander, for instance. His portrayal of Max, with his gravelly voice and sharp one-liners, was essential to the show's charm. He grounded the Hart's glamorous world, serving as comic relief and loyal friend. But during the series' run, viewers noticed he would sometimes vanish without explanation, absent from episodes where his presence seemed natural. Fans assumed it was just a creative choice, but insiders knew the truth was more complicated. Stander, though adored by audiences, came with a complicated Hollywood history. In the 1950s, he had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era, accused of communist sympathies. By the time Hart to Hart rolled around, he had rebuilt his career, but those scars never truly disappeared. Network executives were wary of his outspoken nature and sometimes clashed with him over his blunt behavior on set. Rumors swirled that his occasional absences were less about storylines and more about politics, health, and heated arguments with producers who found him difficult to manage. Then there was Freeway, the lovable canine star. Audiences adored him, but very few knew that Freeway wasn't just one dog. In fact, multiple dogs played the role throughout the series, each trained to perform specific tricks or actions. When one dog grew too old or couldn't manage the workload, another quietly stepped in. Fans never noticed the subtle swaps, though eagle-eyed crew members could tell when a different Freeway was on screen. The illusion of one loyal pet was maintained, but behind the scenes, the role was constantly shifting. Supporting guest stars also seemed to disappear without explanation. Hart to Hart frequently introduced recurring side characters, friends of the Harts, business associates, or rivals, who would appear for a few episodes only to vanish completely. While fans assumed these characters simply weren't needed in future storylines, some cast members later admitted that tensions and politics often played a role. Guest stars sometimes clashed with the leads, or producers found their chemistry lacking. In some cases, budget cuts forced storylines to be rewritten, erasing entire characters overnight. One particularly strange example involved a recurring friend of Jonathan Hart, introduced in the early seasons as a fellow businessman and confidant. He appeared in several episodes, often helping the Harts with information or connections. But midway through Season 2, the character vanished completely. No farewell, no explanation. He was simply gone. Years later, whispers circulated that the actor had grown frustrated with Wagner, who allegedly felt the character was stealing too much of his spotlight. Whether true or not, the disappearance was never addressed on screen, leaving a curious gap for attentive fans. Even Lionel Stander wasn't immune to this pattern. Toward the later seasons, his health began to falter, and long absences grew more frequent. Producers covered for him by writing episodes where Max was away or his role was minimized. At the time, fans chalked it up to creative choices, but in reality, Stander was struggling behind the scenes. He soldiered on until the show ended, but those who worked with him knew how fragile his position sometimes was. The disappearances weren't always sinister. Sometimes they were simply the product of television economics. Supporting cast members didn't have the same contractual protections as the stars, meaning their roles could be cut or shifted with little notice. Budgets were tight, especially as the show grew more expensive to produce, and trimming secondary characters became a common solution. The audience saw it as seamless storytelling. In truth, it was a constant juggling act to keep costs down while maintaining the illusion of consistency. What makes these disappearances so intriguing is how invisible they were to most fans. The show's focus on Jonathan and Jennifer was so strong that the absences of secondary figures rarely broke the spell. Viewers were swept up in the couple's adventures, never stopping to ask why a trusted ally or familiar face had suddenly vanished. Yet for those behind the camera, these gaps told a different story. One of fragile contracts, creative disputes, and the hidden fragility of television production. The magic of Hart to Hart was that it could erase these absences without disrupting the fantasy. Max always seemed loyal, Freeway always seemed present, and the Harts always seemed surrounded by exactly the right people at the right time. But peel back the curtain, and the truth emerges. The supporting cast was just as vulnerable to the pressures and politics of Hollywood as anyone else. They were beloved, but they were also expendable. For audiences in the 1980s, Hart to Hart seemed like a pristine slice of television glamour. It was elegant, glossy, and free of the gritty drama that often plagued Hollywood productions. At least, that's what viewers were meant to believe. What most fans never noticed, or were never allowed to see, were the scandals swirling just beyond the spotlight. Some involved the cast, others the crew, and still others the network itself, which worked tirelessly to keep anything unsavory buried. The Harts might have solved crimes on screen, but off-screen, the network's real job was covering up secrets. One of the most persistent scandals surrounded Robert Wagner. By the time Hart to Hart premiered, he was already a household name, but his past followed him like a shadow. In 1981, during the show's run, Wagner's wife, Natalie Wood, tragically drowned off the coast of Catalina Island under mysterious circumstances. The event made international headlines, and Wagner quickly found himself in the middle of a media storm. Questions swirled. Was it an accident, or was there something darker at play? Though Wagner denied any wrongdoing and was never charged, the whispers persisted. For the network, this was a nightmare. Executives feared that the scandal would sink the show. They launched a quiet but relentless campaign to separate Wagner's personal tragedy from Jonathan Hart's wholesome image. Publicists were instructed to block reporters from asking sensitive questions during press tours. Promotional material emphasized Wagner and Powers' sparkling chemistry, steering attention away from the headlines. Behind closed doors, some insiders even worried that Powers herself might quit, unwilling to be caught in the glare of Wagner's controversy. But she didn't. Instead, she doubled down, supporting her co-star while carefully navigating her own image. Then came the whispers about Stephanie Powers. To the public, she was glamorous, witty, and perfectly composed. But behind the scenes, her personal life was far more turbulent. Powers was in a relationship with William Holden, a Hollywood legend whose career had long been overshadowed by alcoholism. Crew members recalled times when Powers arrived to set emotionally drained, having spent nights dealing with Holden's destructive drinking. Tragically, Holden died in 1981 after a fall in his home, a loss that devastated Powers. Yet the network insisted she maintain her glamorous public persona. Interviews were carefully managed, and Powers was rarely allowed to show the grief she carried. Beyond the personal scandals, there were also the professional ones. Hart to Hart was expensive to produce, with lavish sets, luxury cars, and international shoots. Rumors spread of budget overruns, questionable accounting, and even quiet disputes between producers over how money was being spent. Some crew members whispered about lavish parties funded by the production budget, while others hinted at kickbacks tied to car and wardrobe rentals. None of this ever reached the public, of course. The network made sure of that. But within the industry, the show had a reputation for extravagance, and not all of it was on screen. And then there was Lionel Stander, whose very presence was scandalous to some. Having been blacklisted during the McCarthy era, his return to prominence was both a triumph and a controversy. While fans loved him as Max, certain executives resented his past and wanted him out. More than once, the network quietly discussed writing him off the show. But Stander's popularity with viewers made that nearly impossible. Instead, they tolerated him, burying their discomfort under glowing press releases. There were also rumors, never confirmed but often whispered, that the glamorous lifestyle portrayed on Hart to Hart bled into the private lives of those involved. Extravagant parties, affairs, and quiet indiscretions allegedly swirled around the production. Hollywood insiders claimed that some guest stars had romantic entanglements with crew members, while others suggested Wagner himself enjoyed the blurred lines between Jonathan Hart's persona and his own. Whether true or not, the network worked tirelessly to silence any gossip, fearing it would tarnish the show's polished image. And the biggest scandal of all? That fans never knew just how close the show came to falling apart under the weight of its secrets. When Hart to Hart aired its final episode in 1984, fans were heartbroken. After 5 seasons of glamour, intrigue, and romantic adventure, Jonathan and Jennifer Hart drove off into television history, leaving millions of viewers wondering why such a beloved series had come to an end. The official line was simple: declining ratings and rising costs had made the show unsustainable. But for those who worked on the series, the truth was far more complicated and far more scandalous. The first crack in the facade came from the show's spiraling expenses. By its final seasons, Hart to Hart was one of the most expensive shows on television. The lavish cars, international shoots, designer wardrobes, and sprawling sets drained the budget. Executives grumbled that the cost of producing a single episode rivaled that of some television movies. The network tried to tighten the purse strings, but Wagner and Powers resisted. Both stars felt the show's opulence was part of its DNA. To cut corners would be to destroy its very identity. Yet budgets weren't the only issue. By 1984, Wagner and Powers were exhausted. 5 years of grueling schedules, long hours, and relentless publicity tours had taken their toll. Behind the smiles and champagne flutes was a cast running on fumes. Powers, still coping with the lingering grief of William Holden's death, longed for a break. Wagner, still shadowed by the whispers surrounding Natalie Wood's mysterious drowning, was weary of balancing his personal and professional lives under constant scrutiny. Both stars were consummate professionals, but even professionals burn out. Still, exhaustion alone didn't explain the end. According to insiders, the network itself had grown uneasy with the show's behind-the-scenes controversies. Scandals involving budget irregularities, whispers of on-set feuds, and Wagner's personal baggage had become too heavy to ignore. While audiences saw nothing but glamour, ABC executives worried the polished illusion could crumble at any moment. Quiet discussions began about wrapping up the series before any cracks became too obvious. But there was another factor, one that rarely gets discussed. Television was changing in the mid-1980s. The glossy escapism of shows like Hart to Hart was beginning to feel dated. Audiences were gravitating toward grittier, more realistic dramas, as well as high-concept series that pushed beyond the formula of the detective couple. While still beloved, Hart to Hart no longer felt like the cutting edge of television. Executives feared investing in another season would be throwing money at a format whose time was passing. For Wagner and Powers, the end came as both a relief and a disappointment. They had fought tooth and nail to keep the show alive, protecting their characters from being diminished, insisting on the luxury that defined the series, and preserving the chemistry that fans adored. But by 1984, even they could see the writing on the wall. In interviews years later, both admitted the schedule had been brutal, but neither downplayed the heartbreak of saying goodbye. The irony was that just as the show ended, their bond had grown deeper. They had weathered rivalry, scandal, and exhaustion, and in the process, forged a friendship that endured long after the cameras stopped rolling. Of course, the story didn't entirely end in 1984. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Wagner and Powers reunited for a series of heart-to-heart television movies. But the tone had changed. Gone was some of the glittering escapism, replaced with older, wiser versions of Jonathan and Jennifer who carried the weight of age and loss. Fans embraced the nostalgia, but the magic was different. The movies were love letters to what had been, not reinventions of what could be. So why did Hart to Hart really end? The truth is a tangled web. It was part exhaustion, part scandal, part economics, and part timing. For fans, the ending was bittersweet. They never got the grand farewell they wanted, never saw Jonathan and Jennifer ride off into the sunset in a finale that tied every thread. Instead, the show simply stopped, leaving behind questions and a lingering ache. but perhaps that, too, was fitting. Heart to Heart was always about illusions, of wealth, of perfection, of unbreakable love. And like all illusions, it could never last forever. Heart to Heart gave us elegance, romance, and adventure, but behind the sparkle lay tension, scandal, and secrets fans never saw. The perfect couple was built on fragile illusions. So tell me, did knowing the truth make you love the show more or less? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden Hollywood stories.